My foot is nice and healed, and I've had reconstructive surgery on my Achilles tendon. Once I prove myself in December and I'm firing on all cylinders, I want the Joshua fight. If I get in the ring with him, I will find a way to beat the giant. He is 10 years younger, 3 inches taller, and 3 stone bigger, and I love and relish that kind of challenge. He is the #1, and for good reason. You have the likes of Parker and Wilder, but AJ has all the momentum, and I aim at the very best. I do believe, though, that against Pulev, you will get a world-class performance from the heavyweight champion of the world. He can unify titles as long as he is not against me. Those are the words of the Haymaker, David Haye, still putting himself out there and aiming to become heavyweight champion once more, aiming to defeat Anthony Joshua, so he says. I'm sure if he got an opportunity to fight one of the other champions, he would take the opportunity. It's whichever one comes first and whichever one is the best. I mean, a couple might come around at the same time. I can't help but be interested to see who David Haye fights in December and how he looks, because as I mentioned recently, looking at his training footage, he looks a lot lighter than he was against Tony Bellew. And to me, that's a good thing. And other people who have seen him in person, like the IFL guys and various other journalists, have noted when they've been in his presence interviewing him that he seems to have lost a lot of weight. That, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing, because he looked terrible in his comeback fights, particularly the Bellew fight. His movement was all gone. The foot speed was gone. That was one of the things that made David Haye dangerous at heavyweight, is that he didn't just have fast hands, he also had fast feet. He could get away. He could move his upper body and remain fairly elusive. Against Vladimir Klitschko, he lost the fight clearly, but he didn't get hit with the regularity that most Vladimir Klitschko opponents do, because he had the foot speed and the head movement to get out of the way. So he has to do something at the end of the day, because what he was doing with Shane McGuigan wasn't working. I do wonder why he stacked on so much weight in the first place. Was it to try and protect the injuries? Because that's what sometimes happens when people get these injuries. They try and build up muscle around the injury to protect it. Is that what David Haye was doing? And if so, now that he's seemingly slimmed down and lost a lot of this extra muscle that he previously packed on, will those injuries be more vulnerable again? Now, it's impossible to say, because the fact that he was so heavy might have actually exacerbated his ankle injury in the first place, putting all that extra weight on those ankles. And David Haye is not naturally a 224, 225 pound man. He's naturally a lot lighter than that. So you're packing on all this muscle being held up by this frame, which is not naturally designed to carry that type of weight. But at the same time, when it comes to his shoulder injury, for example, maybe having the extra muscle there helped. You know? So he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, potentially. I guess we'll find out in December. Hopefully it's against somebody decent, because then we'll get a gauge of where he's actually at, and if he actually has improved under Ismail Salas. David Haye, if he's not 37 by now, he will be very shortly. I believe his birthday is in September or October. I think it's September. So he's nearly 37. He's pushing 40 now. It's definitely his last crack at the whip. He knows it. He's already said it. Can he do one good thing again? You know, does he have one last hurrah in him? I don't know. I said a long time ago that I didn't think David Haye would ever regain the heavyweight title, and I stick to that. I said a long time ago that if David Haye does what he claimed he was going to do and fights his way to a heavyweight title fight by taking on top contenders and dangerous fighters, that he'd get beat by one of them. And I still believe the same. As I said in a recent video, David Haye is one of the best managed British fighters I've ever seen. Probably the best managed British heavyweight there's ever been. You could say apart from Joshua maybe, but other than Joshua, the way they've managed David Haye, or excuse me, the way David Haye has managed himself is nothing short of genius from a business point of view, because he's managed to maneuver himself time and time again into big fights without really earning it the conventional way. And I was having a debate recently with somebody who is not a fan of fighters taking control of their own careers and basically being their own promoters. For whatever reason, this individual's not a fan of that. He thinks that it's the wrong thing for a fighter to do. They're not qualified to do that. They'll make a hash of it. They'll end up shooting themselves in the foot, metaphorically speaking. Well, I think it's going to vary between fighter to fighter, and I think more fighters should be trying to go their own route. I would argue that David Haye would not have been as successful as he is financially if he hadn't gone solo, if he hadn't left Frank Maloney and then never signed a long-term deal with a major promoter again. I don't think he'd be as successful as he has been, because going through a major promoter, he might have actually had to go through the conventional way of earning a title shot. At least at some stages of his career, he might have actually had to go that way. And that way may have gotten beaten. That way may have put more miles on the clock than he already has had. That way would have tied him down to long-term contracts where he was actually forced to fight a certain number of times over a certain period. David Haye has taken his career into his own hands where nobody can force him to do anything. Where he's been dealing with broadcasters directly, cutting out the middleman. You know, he did, I mean, look, I'm not defending a lot of the fights that David Haye's been involved in. I'm just talking about, from a financial point of view, I think he's done better solo than he would have done signing a long-term deal with an Eddie Hearn or a Frank Warren. That's just my personal view, for, you know, the reasons I've stated. But David Haye, excuse me, managed to fight Audley Harrison on pay-per-view. And that was a Haymaker promotion. Incredible that he managed to fight Audley Harrison, people, on pay-per-view, and it did good numbers. He got himself a title fight against Nikolai Valuev. He was doing all this without a promoter, promoting himself. Got himself a title shot against Valuev. Fought John Ruiz, his mandatory, sold out. I think that was at the MEN. Another Haymaker promotion. Fought Audley Harrison on pay-per-view, Haymaker promotion. Then got himself a massive fight with Vladimir Klitschko, made an absolute enormous amount of money. That wasn't a Haymaker promotion, that was in Germany, but still, the amount of money he managed to make and the way he manages to position himself, to get himself into these positions to have these big fights, is remarkable. He found himself over there in Germany after Vitaly Klitschko fought Derek Chisora, and he was angling for a fight with Vitaly. He ended up having a brawl at the press conference, famously, with Derek Chisora. And even something like that, which for most fighters would turn out to be a catastrophe, David Haye turned that situation into his advantage. And he ended up fighting Derek Chisora in a big clash at West Ham Football Stadium, making loads of money and beating one of Frank Warren's fighters. And that wasn't a Frank... That was a Frank Warren promotion. That wasn't a David Haye promotion, Haymaker. But he didn't have to sign a long-term deal with Frank Warren. He went over there, he took Frank Warren's money, he knocked out his fighter, and then he sailed off into the sunset. And, you know, if he'd signed a conventional deal with Frank Warren, he would have had to fight, you know, whoever. And he would have had to have dealt with Frank Warren from a business point of view, which is something that David Haye specifically tried to avoid from the beginning of his career, is signing a long-term deal with a Frank Warren particularly. This is what he said previously. But after he left Frank Maloney, he didn't want to sign a long-term deal with anybody. And now he's doing his own thing. Now David Haye has got his platform, Dave, which he's going to try to build with a stable of fighters and put himself on there. We're probably going to see Dave pay-per-view. David Haye fighting up there. I imagine we're probably going to see that at some stage. If he manages to get a big fight, he must at least think about trying to get Dave pay-per-view. you know, to get it on his platform rather than have to go and fight on Sky or one of the other platforms. He'll at least be thinking about, can I get it on Dave? You know, and it's not always about the amount of pay-per-views that you sell. Okay, let me explain something. It's like the old school days in the music industry. I don't know as much about the music industry today as I did back in the days. But back in the days, you got your major labels, you got your indie labels. There are a lot of people I know even today who are independent music artists. Now, I remember a rapper from, the 90s, the 80s and 90s. I know people are always getting on to me about constantly mentioning the 90s, but yeah, there was a rapper called Freddie Fox from New York. And I remember reading an interview with him decades ago. And he was talking about how a lot of the artists who are signed to major labels, who are selling millions of records and they're going gold and platinum, he was talking about how a lot of these artists are actually broke. But yet he has his own label, Freddie Fox at the time, and he's actually making more money than these artists who are selling way more than he is. Why? Because those artists are only getting a fraction of the money for each CD that is sold, right? For each album they sell, they're only getting a fraction of that money. Whereas Freddie Fox was selling far less, but he was getting a far higher percentage. He was maybe keeping, let's say the CD costs $10, he was getting $8 after he paid for distribution and all the other stuff. He was getting $8 out of every CD. All right, hypothetically, I'm not saying these are the exact figures. I'm just giving you an example of the principle of what I'm talking about here. So yeah, he be getting $8 for every CD, but maybe only selling 200,000, whereas the other guy is selling 1 million, but he's only getting $1 per CD. So Freddie Fox ends up making way more than the guy who sold more CDs in a major label. You can apply that kind of thing to boxing when it comes to pay-per-view. David Haye, if he had his own pay-per-view on Dave, there's a likelihood that he'd be keeping a much higher percentage of the pay-per-view on Dave than he would if he was signed to a long-term deal with a major promoter. He'd probably be getting a much smaller percentage of the pay-per-view revenue. So he might actually sell more pay-per-views with a major promoter on a more established platform, but make less money, potentially at least. I'm just talking about in principle, potentially, you could actually make more by selling less pay-per-views on Dave. I'm just throwing that possibility out there. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, all right? Anyway, long convoluted video. I'm thinking out loud here, really, people, but hopefully you've followed what I'm saying. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Does David Haye still have anything left in him? Do you even care about David Haye anymore? I know a lot of people say they don't care. And even I, from time to time, have said I don't care about David Haye no more. But there's something about this guy which keeps on drawing the British public back to him and back to his fights. He's a guy, he's just one of those blessed people in life who always seems to land on his feet. I'm sure most of you know, some of you might be that kind of person. Most of you probably won't be, but you might know somebody like that who, no matter what kind of madness they go through, they always seem to land on their feet and walk a blessed path, whatever happens. Even when bad things happen, the bad thing quickly turns into something good. And it is a case of making your own luck, there's no question. But I personally believe, through what I've seen in my life and what I've observed, that some people, for whatever reason, are inherently more fortunate than others in terms of the way things play out in their lives, But that's a way, way deeper conversation for this channel. That conversation is way too deep here. I am working on a different platform where I'm going to be making non-boxing videos, talking about all kinds of different issues, life, the world, and all kind of different stuff. It won't be on YouTube, it will be elsewhere. Hold tight for an announcement on that in the coming weeks, all right? For now, give me your thoughts on everything I've talked about in this video. David Haye, Anthony Joshua, David Haye's comeback, so on and so forth. It's happening, I'm out.